Hello, adult Sunday school leader. Kind of doing this prep talk from a different place. We'll talk about that in a minute. Okay, this week we're continuing in the unit that's entitled Engaging Culture in an Ever-Changing World. We're looking at Lesson 6. It's called When Materialism Consumes. The lesson text is out of 1 John chapter 2, verses 12 through 17, and chapter 3, verses 16 through 18. And the point of this lesson is that possessions never satisfy nor last, but the love of God does. So as you can tell, I'm recording this in a cemetery. I drive by this cemetery every day on my way to work, and you're thinking, what in the world does this have to do with materialism? Well, anyway, I was out doing a lot of errands and visiting some folks today, and I was thinking about the lesson and thinking, what does it matter what we have in the long run? Because unless the Lord comes, we're all going to end up in a place like this. So what does it matter, the kind of car we drive, the kind of clothes we wear, all that kind of stuff? And I think we know that, but at least as I get older and closer to a place like this, this becomes more and more real to me. All right. So let's look and see some things out of this week's lesson. Okay, we're in 1 John chapter 2. Those first 3 verses in the lesson, your Sunday school material has a lot of excellent commentary on that. And so please look at that. It lists the different categories of believers according to their maturity level. Okay, a lot of commentary there in your Sunday school, LifeWay Sunday school material. So take a good look at that. We get down to verse 15. It says, don't love the world or anything in the world. The epistle of John here that we're looking at, the same author as the Gospel of John. And in his Gospel, John 3:16, it talks about God loving the world. And so it's the same Greek words used here for both love, the form of agape, as well as it's the same Greek words used for world, variations of that word cosmos. And so got the same author, the same words, and in one place it's talking about God loving the world, and here it's like we shouldn't love the world. So what's the difference? I think it's very obvious, though, but just to make sure your class knows that John obviously is using this world, or using the word world, here that cosmos, as a reference to the world system, or what is natural to us. Okay, and I think we know that. We say that in church all the time, don't we? You know, we talk about the way the world does things. And so just make sure the class knows that. We get down to verse 16, and I just want to say that in June of last year, June 2018, there was a lesson on Genesis chapter 3. I believe it was the June 10th lesson. And I went into a lot of detail about this verse in 1 John to explain the Genesis 3 passage. And I used this verse out of 1 John to explain Eve's temptation, Jesus' temptation, and the temptation that we have as well. And so below me here is the address to where you could go watch that video. I would recommend just watching the first 6.5 minutes of that. That's where it goes into the detail about this verse here. You can watch the rest of it if you want to. It just doesn't apply to this lesson. Also, I'm going to put a link in the comments section on the YouTube page to where you can actually click on it and go to it. All right. We look in verse 17 and we see that it'll all pass away. You know, what difference does it make, the stuff we have in 100 years or 10,000 years? You know, I don't want to be a killjoy, and I'm not saying that we can't enjoy life, but it could be that when God blesses you or your classmate or, you know, class members with some material wealth, you know, some kind of windfall, it may be that he's blessing them or you in order that you can be a blessing to someone else. All right. Every windfall that comes our way is not necessarily meant to be used for our own personal pleasure. Also in verse 17 about things passing away, it just reminds me of that old Gaither song, something about that name, where it says, kings and kingdoms will all pass away. But there's something about that name. The next section in 1 John chapter 2, verses 18 through 29, we're actually going to talk about that next week as we look at false religions, all right? So in the previous verses that we've had here in 1 John chapter 2, we've learned what not to do. And basically that's not to be selfish, not to love stuff, Now, we know what we're not supposed to do. Now, what are we supposed to do? Well, that's what's in our next little section of verses, and that's in 1 John chapter 3 verses. First, we see an example of what true love actually is. And we see that in verse 16. This is how we know what love is, that Jesus died for us. And we should do the same thing for our fellow believers. We should be willing to lay down our life for fellow believers. If we have the love of Christ in us, and Christ loved us enough to do that, we should have that same love for our fellow believers. That's a tough one. That's a tough one. You might want to discuss that. Would you die for me? I don't know. So, and then if we're expected to lay down our lives for a fellow believer, then laying down our possessions really shouldn't be that big a deal. It really should be a no-brainer, shouldn't it? And so in verse 17, we see, if I see my fellow believer is truly in need and I don't have pity on him or have pity on her, I need to ask my question, is the love of God really in me? Is that love of God that is exemplified in that selflessness and humility and sacrifice, is it really in me? And then that last verse in 1 John chapter 3, don't just love with words or speech. That's okay, to be nice and kind, of course, but to follow that up with actions and in truth. And that reminds me so much of James chapter 2, verses 14 through 17. It says, if I see my fellow believer in need of food or clothing, and I say to them, well, be warm and well fed, and go on your way, and I don't do anything about it, what good is it? All right, same thought here. Okay, just some random thoughts about the application of this lesson. All right, we can't love stuff more than people, especially our fellow believers, fellow Christians. Reminds me of John chapter 13, verse 35, that says, by this, everyone will know that you are my disciples. How? If you love one another. And this 1 John passage tells us how that love is to be exemplified. Also, we've probably heard the joke or seen the bumper sticker or whatever, that he who dies with the most toys wins. I'm not sure what contest that is, but here's the thing. You die with the most toys, you're still dying. You're still dead. I don't think that constitutes a win. The Treasure Principle by Randy Alcorn is an excellent resource when it comes to materialism or learning how to just be good stewards of our stuff. And in that book, he talks about something that I talk about in my class at least once every 4 to 6 weeks, and that's the dot versus the line. I know I've mentioned that on the PrepTalk several times too. And that is, as you think about the timeline of eternity, all right, you think of that kind of like a number line, and our life is like a little dot in that timeline. I was born in 1961, so from 1961 to 2000, whenever my final breath is taken on this earth, that 60, 70, 80, 90 years, whatever it is just a dot. It's just a speck on the timeline of eternity. And we live so much for that dot, right? Now, we're living in the dot, but we don't need to live for the dot. We need to live in the dot, but live for eternity. So that's just a good thing to think about when you think about materialism or how we're spending our money, those kind of things. Let's be good stewards of what we have and invest in eternal things, all right? All right, so how do we teach our kids, how do we teach our grandkids not to be materialistic? Well, you've probably heard about people who, they might give their child a dollar allowance, which is probably $10 today. And so they would divide that out into 10 dimes or 10 $1 bills and make sure you set aside $1 to go to church. And it's just teaching them stewardship and teaching them that not every one of those $10 is for their pleasure, right? I think it's just a good thing to instill early. And a saying that I've told my daughter from when she's a very young age is just stuff is stuff, all right? Something happens, I lose something and break something, I'm not going to get that upset about it. Stuff is stuff. Now, I need to be a good steward of it, and I need to protect and make sure things are working right. But, if something happens, it's stuff. It's just stuff. All right. What about Christmas and birthday presents? Let's not spoil our kids too much in this area. And I know when the grandkids come along, I'll be testifying to that. It's hard not to just overindulge in gifts. When we do that, what's that teaching them? That stuff is important, all right? How about taking your grandkids on mission trips, letting them see other cultures, let them see how other people live and they manage to be happy without a bunch of stuff, right? Also, let them see you give. Let them see you give to that Salvation Army kettle, or to take good stuff to Goodwill. Not your trash. Don't be taking your trash to Goodwill, but taking stuff to share, okay? It just helps them learn by example. I'm going to give you some scriptures about not necessarily money management, but some scriptures you might want to use in class this week to kind of help support the lesson, about how materialism isn't it and stuff is not it. All right. Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5, Luke 12:15, 1 Timothy chapter 6, verses 9 and 10, Matthew chapter 6, verses 19 through 21, and then verse 24, Ecclesiastes 5:10, Matthew 16:26, and Proverbs 11:28. Now, if you'd like, you can email me. My email address will be coming up here at the end of this prep talk. You can email me, and I will send you these with the scriptures on them, the NIV scriptures, and you can pass those out to your class. You can print that off and pass it out to your class. I'll send that to you in the PDF format if you'd like. So that's what I got for you this week. All right. I think I've spent enough time in this cemetery. I might want to go on to lunch now. All right. I appreciate you guys. Have a great Sunday.